A Prophet on the Road, Haftarat Vayetze. Like many Haftarot, this week's Haftarah also presents a small challenge. Because different communities begin and end at various places, we must decide which part of the Haftarah to focus on. The broader framework begins at Hosea Yud Aleph Zayin and continues until the end of the book. All traditions include the verse Yaakov fled to the fields of Aram and Israel served for a wife, and for a wife he kept sheep, thus neutralizing the annoying question of what's the connection between the Haftarah and the parasha. Before choosing a topic, let me summarize the Haftarah in 2 sentences. Despite all the good things Hashem did for the kingdom of Ephraim and their ancestors throughout the years, they don't really follow in its footsteps. They must understand that Assyria and Egypt won't save them, and eventually they must return to Hashem and abandon their idols, and everything will be okay. In other words, our Haftarah isn't fundamentally different from any other Haftarah, except perhaps for the prophet's identity. Let's choose a topic now and dive in. Let's begin by trying to place this prophecy somewhere in time and space. The first places mentioned in the long Haftarah are Adma and Tzvoim, which the prophet begs Ephraim not to emulate. Hashem doesn't want to have to destroy Ephraim as he destroyed Adma and Tzvoim along with Sodom and Amorah. The location, therefore, is the Jordan Valley, and the time is the era of the patriarchs. Well, the prophecy doesn't occur during the time of the patriarchs. It occurs during the kingdom of Israel, but the point of comparison is the era of the patriarchs. The comparison with the era of the patriarchs is repeated several times. Skipping a few verses to Perek Yud Bet Pasuk Gimel Ad Hey, we'll see that Hashem is disappointed with Yaakov's behavior because he remembers the time when he grasped Esav's heel and strove with God. In Pasuk Yud Gimel we'll mention his flight to the field of Aram, where despite Lavan's effort to deceive him, Hashem ensured he wasn't cheated. To the list of places we can now add to the Jordan Valley, Bet El, Sde Aram, and Yehuda, thus again comparing the sinning kingdoms of Israel to the era of the patriarchs, with a particular emphasis on Yaakov's stories, right? Well, maybe. If we start from Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Yud, then we could see that the comparison is actually with Yetziat Mitzrayim. Ephraim will say, I have become rich, I have found wealth for myself, in all my labors they shall find in me no iniquity that is sin. They forget that I am Hashem from the Egyptian period, when I made them dwell in tents long before they were wealthy. In Pasuk Yud Daled, we're reminded that the exodus from Egypt was done via prophet, and therefore they should abandon idolatry. After all, in Egypt and in the wilderness, there were no other gods. The places mentioned here are Egypt, Gilgal, and Gilad, places the children of Israel passed on their way to the Promised Land. Although Gilad could also connect to Yaakov when he returned from Aram. These are the prominent times and places mentioned in the Haftarah. However, between the lines, we can identify the transition period between the judges and the monarchy. In this context, we would explain Gilgal and Gilad a little bit differently. The mentions of Gilgal, where Bnei Israel renewed Shaul's kinship, and Gilad, or in Shaul's context, Yavesh Gilad, the site of his first military operation, whose people also took care of Shaul's burial. And if you want, we can find several contrast between Shomron and Yehuda with reference to Lebanon, from whose trees the temple was built, and to the wise man, which might be maybe Shlomo, who built Bet HaMikdash. It turns out then that we need to find the connection between Sodom, Yaakov, the Exodus, the wilderness, Shaul's coronation, and the building of the temple. Oh, and don't forget that we also want to somehow connect all this to the improper behavior of Ephraim, who I forgot to mention focus heavily on what's happening in Assyria and Egypt. Add to this the chronological disorder in which the different topics appear and repeat themselves, and you've got a confused Dovi. To try and create some order, I want to argue that this prophecy isn't directed at those who we might expect it to be directed at, namely the leaders of the people. I have several proofs for this by way of negation. For example, the accusation Ephraim has surrounded me with lies and the house of Israel with deceit. seems to be addressing the sinning people, not the leader, a recurring phenomenon throughout the Haftarah. Also, the verse, "You said give me a king and princes," isn't directed at the king. After all, he didn't choose himself. To who, then, is the rebuke directed? A further examination of the various claims in the Haftarah points to a common denominator in all the sins. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, but these are cheating lies. He daily increases lies and desolation, again, from cheating and stealing. A merchant in whose hands are false balances. They made them molten images of their silver. These are just a few examples of sins from the Haftarah that stem from economic abundance. Where does this economic abundance come from? They make covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. The prophet describes extensive trade relations of the kingdoms of Israel, stretching from Assyria to Egypt. In my opinion, the prophecy is directed at these merchants, which can also explain the different periods and their dispersion throughout the Haftarah. The prophet isn't sitting in the palace in Samaria, citing random cases and places from Israeli history. He moves along the main trade routes, especially those between Assyria and Egypt, but not only, and meets the economic engines at strategic sites, these merchants. In Gilad, the place of the covenant with Lavan, who tried to deceive Yaakov, he'll try to dissuade them from lies and deceit. In Egypt, he'll remind them that when they left Egypt, they needed nothing more than tents. In Bethel, he'll remind them that there is no need for calves. Yaakov strove there with Hashem. In Lebanon, from where the cedars are taken for building the temple, and in Yehuda, he'll try to return them to Hashem, to the Mikdash. If I'm right, as has occasionally been known to happen, not just the verse about Yaakov's flight is connected to the parasha. This becomes the essence of the Haftarah. To try to teach the intended recipients of the prophecy, the prophet Hosea, just like Yaakov in his time, packs his bags and sets out. In loving memory of my heroic student, Amichai Shimon ben Ishayan bat Yerubin, Hashem Yikom Damo, Dovi Holtz, one who loves Tanakh.